The stadium was full. 60,000 people had waited months for this moment. Some had flown in from other countries. Some had saved for the better part of a year just to stand in that crowd and hear one man sing. The lights were down. The energy inside Engenhão Stadium in Rio de Janeiro was the kind that builds in your chest before a single note is played. Then the announcement came. There would be no show tonight. Harry Styles would not be taking the stage. The reason given was simple. He was ill. But simple reasons rarely satisfy 60,000 people who traveled across a country, or across an ocean, to be in that stadium. And behind that simple reason was a story that nobody in the crowd had been told yet. Something had been building long before that night. Something that the people closest to Harry Styles had been watching with quiet concern for weeks. The cancellation in Brazil did not come out of nowhere. It came at the end of a stretch that would have broken most people down long before it broke him. To understand what happened in Rio de Janeiro, you have to understand what the Love on Tour campaign actually was. Not the glamorous version. Not the highlight reel of sold-out arenas and screaming crowds and front-page photographs. The real version. The one measured in consecutive nights, back-to-back cities, time zones crossed without recovery, and a body asked to perform at its absolute limit night after night after night. Love on Tour became one of the highest-grossing concert tours in music history. It ran across multiple years, multiple continents, and hundreds of individual shows. Harry Styles did not just headline those shows. He owned them. He danced. He sang live without leaning on backing tracks the way many artists at his level quietly do. He engaged the crowd for hours at a time. He made every person in every seat feel like the show was built specifically for them. That kind of performance does not come free. It costs something. And by the time the tour reached South America, the bill was coming due. What made the Brazil cancellation land differently than a typical tour postponement was the timing. South America was not a routine stop. For Harry Styles, these dates carried a specific weight. The crowds in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile had waited longer than almost any other fan base on Earth. Touring schedules had skipped over or delayed South American dates for years, not just for Styles but for major international acts across the board. So when Love on Tour finally arrived in that part of the world, the emotional stakes were already higher than usual. These were not fans who had seen their favorite artist multiple times and were coming back for another night. Many of them were getting their first and possibly only chance. That context matters because it shapes everything that came after the announcement. The reaction from the crowd outside Engenhão Stadium was not simple disappointment. It was something heavier than that. Something that mixed genuine worry for him with the particular grief of a moment that had been years in the making suddenly dissolving into nothing. The social media response was immediate. Within minutes of the announcement, the name Harry Styles was trending across every major platform. But what stood out about that online reaction was not the volume of it. It was the tone. There was very little anger. There was very little of the entitled outrage that sometimes follows a high-profile cancellation. Instead, what filled the timelines and comment sections was something closer to genuine concern. Fans were asking whether he was okay. They were asking what had happened. They were asking whether anyone around him had given a real answer yet. That reaction said something important about the relationship between Harry Styles and the people who follow his work. It was not the reaction of a fan base that felt cheated. It was the reaction of people who were actually worried about someone they cared about. That distinction matters more than it might first appear. Harry Styles has built something unusual in the modern music industry. He has built a following that does not just consume his work. It invests in him as a person. That kind of connection takes years to develop, and it does not happen by accident. It happens because the person at the center of it has spent years showing up in a way that feels real. From the earliest days of One Direction through his solo career, Styles developed a reputation for a specific kind of presence. He was warm without being performative. He was funny without being desperate for laughs. He was open about certain parts of himself while remaining genuinely private about others. That balance is harder to maintain than it looks. Most public figures collapse into one extreme or the other. They either overshare everything until nothing feels meaningful, or they wall themselves off so completely that audiences stop feeling any connection at all. Styles found a middle ground and held it. So when something went wrong in Brazil, the people who had been paying attention for years did not immediately reach for cynicism. They reached for concern instead. The official statement that came from his team was brief. Harry is unwell and unable to perform tonight. The show will be rescheduled. Refunds will be available. That was largely the extent of it. No dramatic detail. No lengthy medical explanation. No carefully worded paragraph designed to manage the story before it could manage itself. Just a short, direct acknowledgement that something was wrong and that the show could not go on. In a media environment built around oversharing, that restraint was noticeable. It was also very consistent with the way Styles and his team have always handled moments that required privacy. They have never been a machine that feeds every development to the press. When something personal happens, the circle stays tight. Information comes out slowly if it comes out at all. That approach protects him. It also feeds the concern of the people on the outside of that circle who genuinely want to know that he is alright. Because when you give people very little, their imagination fills the rest. And in the hours after the Brazil cancellation, imaginations were working hard. The questions multiplied faster than any official response could have addressed them. How sick was he exactly? Had there been warning signs before that night? Had he pushed through earlier shows when he should have stopped? Was this a single bad night, or was it something that had been building underneath the surface for much longer than anyone outside his immediate circle knew? Those questions were not unreasonable. Because the people asking them had been watching closely enough to notice certain things. There had been moments during the South American leg of the tour that, looked at in hindsight, told a slightly different story than the one the highlight reels were telling. There were nights where his voice sounded different. Not broken. Not absent. But different in the way that a voice sounds when the body carrying it is running low on something it needs. There were moments on stage where the energy that usually felt effortless seemed to be costing him more than usual. None of it was dramatic. None of it was the kind of thing that stops a show or makes headlines on its own. But taken together, those small signals formed a picture that made the Brazil cancellation feel less like a sudden event and more like an eventual one. This is the part of touring that the music industry has never been particularly honest about. The public sees the stage. It sees the lights and the setlist and the footage of a performer at the peak of their powers in front of a roaring crowd. What it does not see is everything that surrounds the 2-hour window. It does not see the travel days that blur into each other until no city feels distinct from the last. It does not see the vocal rest that gets sacrificed because there is press to do and appearances to make and a machine around the artist that never fully stops moving even when the artist desperately needs it to. It does not see the moment in a dressing room or a hotel corridor or the back of a car when the person at the center of all of it quietly crosses a line. They cannot come back from that night. Harry Styles is not the first artist to hit that wall on a major tour. He will not be the last. But what made his situation particular was the scale of what Love on Tour had become and the standard he had set for himself within it. He had built a reputation as one of the most committed live performers of his generation. Night after night, he delivered shows that felt complete. Not performances where you could sense an artist conserving energy or going through motions. Full shows. Present shows. The kind where the audience leaves feeling like something real happened in that room. Maintaining that standard across hundreds of nights is not a matter of talent alone. It is a matter of physical endurance that has a ceiling regardless of how much a person wants to push through it. And when that ceiling arrives, it does not always announce itself politely. Sometimes it announces itself in a stadium in Rio de Janeiro in front of 60,000 people who have been waiting years for that exact night. The cruelty of that timing is something worth sitting with for a moment. Not cruelty directed at the fans, though their disappointment was real and earned. But cruelty in the more impersonal sense. The way that bodies do not negotiate with schedules. The way that illness does not check a tour calendar before deciding to arrive. The way that the worst possible moment for something to go wrong is very often exactly when it does. For Styles, who had given so much of himself to that tour for so long, the idea of not being able to deliver on one of the most emotionally loaded nights of the entire run carried its own particular weight. People who know him have consistently described the same quality at his core. He takes his responsibility to his audience seriously. Not in a corporate, carefully managed way. In a personal way. In the way of someone who genuinely understands that the people in those seats have given real time and real money and real emotional investment to be there. That sense of responsibility does not switch off because a body stops cooperating. If anything, it makes the moment harder. Because the mind that cares that much is still fully present even when the body cannot follow. What happened in the hours after the cancellation revealed something important about who Harry Styles is when the performance is stripped away and there is nothing left but the moment itself. He did not stay silent. He did not let his team handle everything while he disappeared behind closed doors and waited for the story to settle. He came forward. The message he sent to his fans in Brazil was not written in the polished language of a publicist. It did not have the careful, managed quality of a statement designed to minimize damage and move on. It read like something written by a person who was genuinely gutted by what had happened and needed the people affected to know that. He told them he was sorry. He told them how much those shows had meant to him. He told them that not being able to take that stage was not something he took lightly. He told them he loved them. Those words landed differently than a standard apology because they arrived without the usual machinery around them. They felt direct in a way that public communication from artists at his level rarely does. And the response from the fan base told you everything about how they were received. But concern did not disappear. But it shifted. It moved from the anxious, unanswered worry of the hours immediately following the announcement toward something more like a collective exhale. He was okay enough to reach out. He was okay enough to care about reaching out. That mattered to people. It also revealed something about the dynamic that had been quietly building between Styles and his audience across the entire run of Love on Tour. This was not a transactional relationship dressed up in the language of connection. It was something that had been tested across years and hundreds of nights and had held. The fans who stood outside Engine House Stadium that evening, some of them in tears, some of them quietly consoling each other, some of them simply standing in the strange suspended moment of an evening that had not gone the way they had planned, were not just disappointed customers. They were people who had a genuine investment in him. And he knew it. The rescheduled dates were announced with what felt like genuine urgency from his team. Not the slow, bureaucratic pace of an industry working through logistics. The kind of pace that suggested everyone involved understood the specific weight of what had been lost that night and wanted to address it as directly as possible. For many fans, the rescheduled dates brought real relief. For others, the practicalities of travel and time and money meant that the original night was the only night that had ever been possible for them. That is the part of a cancellation that never fully resolves. You can reschedule a show. You cannot reschedule the specific circumstances that allowed a particular person to be in that stadium on that particular evening. The woman who had saved for 8 months and arranged childcare and booked a flight from a city 6 hours away does not necessarily get those stars to align again just because a new date appears on a calendar. Harry Styles knew that. The people around him knew that. And that awareness shaped everything about the way the situation was handled from the moment the announcement went out to the moment the apology arrived in the feeds of the people it was meant for. What the Brazil cancellation ultimately exposed was not a crack in the armor of a carefully constructed public image. It exposed something more human and more interesting than that. It exposed the reality of what it costs to be the kind of performer Harry Styles has chosen to be. The level of presence he brings to a live show. The level of personal investment he makes in every audience. The refusal to phone it in or scale back or deliver a lesser version of the experience just because the schedule is brutal and the body is struggling. That standard has a price. And in Rio de Janeiro, on a night 60,000 people will not forget, that price came due in the most public way possible. The conversation that followed the Brazil cancellation, in the days and weeks after, was notable for what it was not. It was not dominated by speculation about whether Harry Styles would continue the tour. It was not filled with discourse about whether he had been pushing too hard or whether his team had failed him or whether the industry standard of back-to-back performances was sustainable. Those conversations existed, but they were quieter than they might have been. What dominated instead was a simpler sentiment. People wanted him to be okay. That sentiment came not just from fans but from people in the industry who had watched what Love on Tour had become. Artists who understood the demands. Producers who knew what 60,000-seat stadiums night after night actually required of a human body. Musicians who had stood on stages and understood the exact moment when performance instinct starts pulling from a place deeper than physical resources can actually support. The Brazil cancellation became a moment where people across the industry seemed to collectively acknowledge something that is not talked about enough in public. The cost of being a certain kind of artist. Not the glamorous cost. Not the financial cost that gets discussed in interviews about the price of fame. The actual physical and emotional cost of showing up at the level Harry Styles had committed to showing up at for his entire career. The days that followed revealed another layer to the story. Styles did not simply rest and recover and wait for the next date on the calendar to arrive. He made decisions about how to move forward that felt characteristic of who he is. He stepped back from some obligations. He gave his body and his voice actual space to heal. He did not rush back to a grueling schedule because there was an expectation that he would. He took the time he needed. That decision, which might seem obvious in isolation, is less obvious in the context of a massive international tour where every date carries logistical complexity and financial implications across an entire ecosystem of people. But he made it anyway. The message that was sent was clear. The shows would resume. But they would resume when he could actually deliver on the standard he had set for himself. Not before. Not as a compromise. Not with a half-strength version of what those audiences deserved. That commitment to the people showing up for him, even in a moment when he was the one who needed rest, said something about the person at the center of this story. It said that the connection between Harry Styles and his audience was not something he was willing to sacrifice on the altar of schedule maintenance. It said that he understood something fundamental about the transaction that happens in a live performance. When people gather in a room and make themselves vulnerable to what an artist is offering, that artist has a responsibility to meet them with something real. He had chosen, across his entire career, to honor that responsibility. The Brazil cancellation did not change that. It just exposed it more clearly. The rescheduled shows happened. The tour continued. Life moved forward in the way that it does. But the night in Rio de Janeiro remained significant for anyone paying attention. It was a moment where the machinery of the music industry, which usually runs very smoothly and very quietly in the background, suddenly became visible. It was a moment where the human being at the center of a massive operation became the priority instead of the schedule. It was a moment where 60,000 people and millions more watching from a distance learned something about what they valued most. Not the perfect execution of a show. Not the flawless delivery of a night planned and promoted for months. But the integrity of the person who had promised to give them something real. And who, when his body told him he could not do that, was honest enough to say so instead of delivering something less. That kind of honesty is rare in an industry built on the mythology of invulnerability. It is rare to see an artist at his level acknowledge that there is a limit. That the body has a voice. That rest is not a failure. That sometimes the most responsible thing to do is to step back instead of pushing forward. The Brazil cancellation became a moment that meant something beyond the immediate disappointment of a cancelled show. It became a moment where people saw someone they cared about choose himself without apology. And they respected that choice. That is the story that will stay. Not the night the show did not happen. But the night that showed us who was standing in the center of it.